Senator Stoker. Senator Whish-Wilson.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. Well, today we have legislation before us, implementing legislation on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. This deal started in 2005, Acting Deputy President, nearly 13 years ago, following the imminent failure of the Doha multilateral trade rounds. It didn't really get supercharged until after 2010, when President Obama put his stamp on it. But it's been a long time in the coming, indeed. And we need to ask ourselves as a chamber, why is that? Why has it taken nearly 13 years for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement to come to us in legislation? Well, you can draw your own conclusions. It's extremely complex, extremely divisive and controversial and unpopular. And I say to the senators in the chamber here today and those listening, for 6 years I have been campaigning against this trade deal. 16 so-called trade deal. 6 years. Senator Milne, prior to me in 2010, opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and my colleague Senator Hanson-Young has done an excellent job in recent years carrying the green flag on this. There's a good reason. There's a good reason that we oppose the TPP. This is a corporate takeover of our democracy. That's what it is, to put it in a nutshell. You can come in here and bung on as much as you want with speeches that have been written for you by staffers about what a great deal this is for the country. If you have a look at it closely, you'll see that the majority of countries in the TPP-11 we already have bilateral trade deals with very, very limited increase in market access. Because this is actually not really a deal in the sense of a free trade deal, the way the coalition are describing it. This is much more about services and investment. This is a deal for large multinational corporations. Let me tell you a little bit more about this. When the TPP negotiations were underway, there was no access at all for community groups, for stakeholders apart from big corporations who had exclusive access. They were covered completely by commercial in confidence clauses about what could be disclosed. And of course we had our negotiators, our DFAT negotiators, who I for 5 years tried to get answers out of every estimates and seemingly felt insulted when we asked them questions about what was going on behind closed doors. And it wasn't just us in this country. I know our counterparts and stakeholders I've dealt with in other countries had very similar issues. We have a deal that's essentially synchronising laws and regulations around things as important as investment and services, things that cover nearly every facet of our life in this country, being negotiated behind closed doors by people who aren't responsible to Parliament. Now, what did I do when I took on this issue in 2012? I looked at our treaty-making process and I initiated an inquiry which went for some time. And I recommend senators actually have a read of that inquiry. It's called Blind Agreement: Reforming Australia's Treaty-Making Process. Now, when the committee, the Defence, Foreign Affairs and Trade Committee, released this report, I don't think there was any disagreement amongst any senator from any political party that our treaty-making process is in dire need for change and for reform. The committee correctly identifies that the scope and complexity of modern trade or partnership agreements, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, makes the case for reform compelling. And the committee identified 3 areas for urgent reform: transparency, consultation and independence. The committee also acknowledged that the incursion of modern trade or partnership negotiations into matters of domestic policy and public interest is such that they now function as a de facto level of government. A de facto level of government. And what have we done to reform our treaty-making process, Acting Deputy President? Absolutely nothing. We've done absolutely nothing. The Greens put a dissenting report in at the end of that committee hearing, unfortunately, while we got general agreement that our treaty-making process was in urgent need of reform. Of course, the Labor Party said we're a party of government. We We don't want to jeopardise the executive power that goes with government, but that's ultimately the tension within trade deals. The executive are the ones who control trade deals with their Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and other negotiators. And when they've got the deal to a point where they think it's good, they then give it to Parliament. And guess what? It goes through a JSCOT rubber stamp process, government controlled committee. We have a references committee that's opposition controlled, but that often recommends change, but nothing ever happens. And we get lock, stock and barrel. We either vote for the whole lot or we can reject it. And there are some good things in these trade deals. Why can't we change it? It's just not possible under our treaty-making process. It's a joke that we'd get given thousands of pages of text around these extremely complex trade deals and investment deals that cover just about every aspect of our life in this country and elsewhere, and we can't change a bloody thing. And if we do, it jeopardises the entire deal. So nobody does. And I've seen it with the Japanese free trade deal, I've seen it with the Korean free trade deal, I've looked at it in relation to the Chinese free trade deal, the RCEP agreement, the new Indonesian deal underway, same thing. No move at all to reform our treaty-making process. If we had, and I recommend senators read that report, because there's a number of recommendations about what we can do to reform our treaty-making process, so we don't get ourselves in this situation here, this farce, where we have to say yes or no to thousands of pages of detail on extremely complex matters of investment and trade. Now, the Greens support trade, Acting Deputy President, but we support fair trade. One of the reasons the Doha multilateral round of negotiations fell apart, which included all WTO members, one of the reasons was there was enormous hostility from civil society all around the world. Nearly 40,000 protesters turned up in Seattle, which has been commonly now called the Battle of Seattle, to protest against globalisation and rules being written for sovereign nations like Australia by multinational corporations behind closed doors with compliant governments, the same governments who are taking donations from those large corporations, at the exclusion of civil society and parliaments around the world. And it fell apart. Why were the Greens, why did Senator Milne, why did myself and others make an early decision that we weren't going to support the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement? We have a fundamental philosophy that every environmental problem on this planet and just about every social problem on this planet is caused by a business activity or a commercial activity. I want senators to reflect on that. Whether it's climate change, the warming of our oceans, the loss of half the Great Barrier Reef, or whether it's overfishing, whether it's trashing of our forests, whether it's pollution of rivers, you name it, it's caused by business activity. So when we have all the business CEOs in one room secretly negotiating a deal, why wouldn't we include externalities and rules and regulations that control business activity that cause all these problems or undermine workers' rights? All the kind of criticisms that have been raised by my party in this debate. Well, I've raised this issue too, and by the way, it's in the treaty reform bill. And the only answer we've ever got is it's not the right forum for that, Senator. It's not the right forum for dealing with emissions. Well, what is? The Paris Agreement? Kyoto Agreement? Look at that. The factors that we are about to sign up to in here, including state-to-state dispute settlements and investor-state dispute settlements, and a number of other things, are binding agreements. They are binding agreements. But do you think we could get anywhere near a binding agreement on environmental protections between 11 or 12 countries? Look at Japan. Japan has taken the leadership on this TPP-11 when the US pulled out. Only a few weeks ago, they threatened to walk out of the International Whaling Commission because they didn't get their way. So much for a rules-based order. We have legislation before us today that has come to us from Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, the same Prime Minister who's agitating to increase the size of their whaling fleet and walk away completely from an international rules-based order on whaling, including in the Australian whale sanctuary in the Southern Ocean? Do you think there's something in the TPP that might hold the Japanese to account on an activity like killing cetaceans? Well, there's a few platitudes in there, but there's nothing binding that we can turn around to Japan and say, wait a second, you want to be our friend and ally on all these areas to do with trade and investment. What about the protection of cetaceans? That's what Australians feel strongly about. What about action on emissions? The illegal trade of wildlife? Nothing binding in these agreements at all on that, because it's not a priority. It's not a priority for the corporations that cause a lot of these problems, and it's clearly not a priority for our government or most governments around the world. That's why civil society has been fighting these multilateral agreements, because they want fair trade. They don't mind trade agreements, but they want agreements that are fair for all stakeholders, not just agreements that are written for business. And let's talk about investor-state dispute settlements. Another thing that, Acting Deputy President, you may not be surprised that I wanted to know a lot more about when I was carrying the can for this portfolio. So, once again, I had the committee's agreement to have another wide-ranging inquiry into ISDS. It was called Trade and Foreign Investment Protecting the Public Interest Bill 2014. It went for 18 months. We were the only parliament in the world that had an inquiry into ISDS and banning ISDS. I had the French consulate and other people contact. There was a lot of interest in this inquiry. It's been quoted in journals all around the world since the inquiry. And oddly enough, we got to hundreds of pages of evidence from witnesses, including ISDS experts and lawyers who conduct ISDS cases, investor-state dispute settlement cases. And there was agreement in the committee that these ISDS clauses had certainly outlived their use-by date and weren't necessary anymore. Yet, do you think we could get them banned from future trade deals like the Greens push for? The key reason the committee said, no, we're not going to ban these because